From New Orleans bordellos to the Beatles, marijuana has played a seminal role in the creation of both jazz and rock. This episode, the final chapter of the Marijuana Trilogy, Dr. Mark Plotkin examines the roles of cannabis in the creation of these art forms while profiling two extraordinary individuals, Louis Armstrong and Mezz Mezzrow.
Welcome to Plants of the Gods. Today we're doing the third episode of the Marijuana Trilogy. In the first episode, we learned how marijuana is as American as apple pie. In the second episode, which focused on cannabis fiber, we learned how marijuana helped build the colonial economy and win World War II. This episode examines how marijuana played a seminal role in the creation of jazz in my hometown of New Orleans. And I want to give a special shout out to Dr. Adam Rathke of the University of Dayton and Dr. Christopher Duval of the University of Mexico, whose groundbreaking research on the history and cultural impact of marijuana is second to none. Now, when I was growing up in New Orleans in the 1970s, marijuana was the forbidden fruit. The use of marijuana became widespread among students, of which I was one, but it was something that was kept very secret. In fact, knowing and smoking dope was considered the height of coolness. Almost like a secret password or a secret rite of passage. You never told adults about this, being certain they simply would not and could not understand. Also remember that this was under the Nixon administration, at the height, or actually the depths, of the so-called war on drugs. Marijuana was regarded as the gateway to addiction and all sorts of other terrible things. Remember the discussion on reefer madness we covered in the earlier episodes, which gives more detail on this. In the mid-70s, I spent the summer working in a law firm in New Orleans to earn enough money to go to the Amazon for the first time. One scorching August afternoon, I got called in by my uncle, who was the CFO of the firm in which I was working, who told me, "Sit down, I want to talk to you." I did as I was told, as he was quite a fearsome character, a brawler who was still getting into bar fights late into his 60s. He looked at me and asked, "Do you smoke marijuana?" Well, I was petrified of being put on the spot like this with such a loaded question. Marijuana was not only illegal, but it was something you never discussed with older people, particularly members of your family. But my father had taught me a very important lesson, which is, when you're asked a question that you don't want to answer with a question. So I looked at my uncle, quite shaken, and replied, "Why are you asking me that?" And to my eternal astonishment, he looked at me and said, "Because I used to smoke it when I was a kid." I was stunned. I could not believe what I was hearing. I stammered, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, when I was growing up, nice Jewish boys didn't have sex with nice Jewish girls before they were married. We drop off our dates and save 2 bits, which is New Orleans parlance for 25 cents, and then go down to Storyville and, quote, get our ashes hauled." Storyville was the red light district, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. In 1987, a New Orleans councilman by the name of Sidney Story was concerned about prostitution becoming ever more widespread in the city. His recommended solution to control prostitution, and based on the approach in places like Holland or Germany, Story and his colleagues proposed the establishment of a legalized prostitution district, much like you might see in Amsterdam today. Story then wrote and helped pass an ordinance establishing a zone known as the District, the first legal red light district in the United States. And much to the eternal horror of the straight-laced Story, the district quickly became known as, quote, Storyville, which is how it is remembered today. So my uncle continued, quote, "We'd go down there, meet the prostitutes, take care of business. And while we were visiting, the ladies would give us something to smoke, and it wasn't tobacco. They called it muggles, a word I'd never heard before, but have never forgotten." My uncle continued, "Made me feel a little funny, but it really made me hungry." So I knew that he was talking about marijuana. But I decided to cross-check this stunning information. Over dinner that evening, I casually asked my father, "Dad, what's muggles?" And he looked at me, probably as astonished as I was during my conversation earlier that day with his brother, and replied, quote, "Well, that's what you guys would call marijuana. I haven't heard that word in 40 years. Fast forward a few years, and I was taking a night school course at Harvard on the history of jazz. One chilly September evening, the professor, a fellow named Tom Everett, announced that we were going to discuss Louis Armstrong for class that evening. Everett began, "Now, many of you think of Louis Armstrong as this funny old guy with a white handkerchief on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show, but he's actually a musical genius, a virtuoso who was a founding father of jazz in the early 20th century." He continued, "I want to start by playing my favorite Louis Armstrong song. Most of you think it's probably Hello, Dolly. But it's actually a different song with a weird title, the meaning of which I've never been able to figure out. The name of the song is Muggles." Well, I almost fell off my chair. I'd heard that word before. Remember, this is decades before Harry Potter. Like me, Louis was a native New Orleanian. Doing further research, I learned that he was not only a devoted marijuana smoker, but that he and many other New Orleans musicians considered cannabis a source of musical creativity and inspiration. More on that later in this episode. Clearly, Muggles, marijuana, was widespread in New Orleans near the turn of the last century. And also clearly, it was widespread in Storyville, which is widely considered the cradle of jazz. Prior to the advent of Storyville, many of the Afro-American geniuses who created this music were manual laborers, one of the few jobs open to them in the segregated South. At the turn of the century, New Orleans was a booming economic powerhouse with an economy centered on the port that brought in people, cultures, plant products, and music from around the world. High-end prostitution generated even more money, and not just for the people directly involved in prostitution, but for the musicians who could then afford to quit their brutal day jobs on the docks and pick up their instruments to play all night in the most exclusive bawdy houses. This is yet another reason to consider marijuana as one of the plants of the gods. Remember, a continuing theme with our podcast series is how these mind-altering plants affect consciousness, how they inspire people, how they foster creativity, and marijuana played a fundamental role in the creation of jazz, which has in turn been called America's greatest art form. There are many historical theories about why jazz began in New Orleans. The presence of instruments left over from the Civil War, the fact that the city was an international crossroads, being a port filled with people from Europe and the Caribbean and Africa and Latin America, the presence of a Creole class deeply schooled in classical European music. But I'm here to tell you that I believe that the birth of jazz in New Orleans was due in no small part to marijuana. And here's why I think that. When you read Jelly Roll Morton's description of growing up in New Orleans and playing in Storyville, you can see that the city was awash in drugs, and Jelly, who spent much of his time and made a lot of money playing piano in the most exclusive whorehouses, talked about the prevalence of drugs and how they were available to everyone, and very often used by both the prostitutes and the musicians. In the case of the opiates and cocaine, these products were taken for endurance and for being able to go all night. But some of it, and certainly in the case of musicians smoking Muggles, it was for inspiration as well. And let me tell you how I know that. If you listen to the Smithsonian Anthology of Jazz, you hear a very famous version of Scott Joplin playing the Maple Leaf Rag, which I believe is the second cut on the album. Joplin, who composed the piece, plays a version formal and carefully timed, a ragtime version. However, there's a much more obscure cut on the album, and that is Jelly Roll Morton playing his version of the Maple Leaf Rag, and he's rocking all over the beat. And we all know that marijuana changes your perception of time. I want to tell you that smoking marijuana led to this change and the distortion of the sense of time, which led musicians breaking the bonds of formerly played ragtime music and led to improvisation, which was the creation of jazz. And improvisation and jazz are linked today as they were way back then. According to cannabis historian Ernest Abel, quote, "It was in these bordellos where music provided the background and not the primary focus of attention that marijuana became an integral part of the jazz era. Unlike booze, which dulled and incapacitated, marijuana enabled musicians whose jobs required them to play long into the night to forget their exhaustion. Moreover, the drug seemed to make their music sound more imaginative and unique, at least to those who played and listened while under its sensorial influence." Even an anti-marijuana crusader of the 20th century, the memorably named Dr. James Munch, agreed. He said, quote, "Because the chief effects of marijuana was that it lengthens the sense of time, and therefore jazz musicians could get more grace beats into their music than they could if they simply followed the written copy. In other words, if you're a musician, you're going to play the thing the way it's printed on a sheet. But if you're using marijuana, you're going to work in about twice as much music between the first note and the second. And that's what gives jazz musicians the idea they could jazz things up. Liven it up, you see."
To purchase Dr. Mark Plotkin's new book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, or his first book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, visit your local bookseller or order from Amazon.com.
So how did marijuana first enter the U.S.? There's a lot of historical debate about this, but the consensus is it entered the American Southwest from Mexico. Remember, at the turn of the century, there was a lot of political unrest in Mexico, which led to the Mexican Revolution. Most believe that this influx of Mexican immigrants brought marijuana with them. In the southeastern U.S., New Orleans was the dominant port of Central America and the Caribbean. West Indian sailors and immigrants brought marijuana into the states with them. Also keep in mind that New Orleans has always been a very international and unique town. It was settled first by the Native Americans, and then by the French, and then the Spanish took over, and then the French took over, and the Americans took over. So you had this very cosmopolitan population, European, Caribbean, Latin American, and even African by dint of slavery, that didn't exist in much of the rest of the country. However, in 1917, the U.S. military decided to shut down Storyville since New Orleans was a port for shipping soldiers to Europe for World War I. The Secretary of the Navy was worried about soldiers and sailors visiting Storyville and contracting venereal disease. Remember that many of these fellows came from far more provincial cities and had never seen anything like New Orleans or Storyville. In a clever bit of marketing, however, the train station had been situated literally across the street from Storyville, so those arriving soldiers would see scantily clad, or unclad, women waving and beckoning to them from the windows of the brothels. Also remember that this was decades before the development of antibiotics, so a case of syphilis could be a death sentence. When the Secretary of the Navy ordered the closing of Storyville, it was despite the wishes of the New Orleans political power structure, because everybody was making money, not just the prostitutes, most of whom undoubtedly made very little, but the cops, the politicians, and even the musicians. Mayor Martin Berman put it best, quote, "You can make prostitution illegal, but you can't make it unpopular." With the shuttering of Storyville, the jazz musicians went where the money was, and that was Chicago. Many of the jazz musicians first ventured out of New Orleans to play on the riverboats that plied the Mississippi River. One of the most famous bands was that of Fate Maribel, and people like Joe Oliver, who was Louis Armstrong's original mentor, Armstrong himself, and the famous Dodds brothers were part of his band. In fact, this is where many New Orleans musicians like Louis learned to read music. In a cultural sense, these Afro-American musicians were part of the Great Migration northwards, escaping evil Jim Crow laws and in search of economic opportunity. And the musicians brought their jazz and their demand for marijuana with them. The capital of this musical migration was Al Capone's Chicago. As I said, one of the reasons that this was so important in the birth of jazz is that the drugs seemed to make the music sound more imaginative and unique. I've already quoted folks who agreed with this assessment, and there are many musicians that attest to this, but I think the story of Louis Armstrong is particularly illustrative. Louis Armstrong was born in a part of New Orleans known as the Back of Town. It is where City Hall stands today, across the street from the Superdome Stadium. He was the son of a prostitute and barely knew his father, but he was a musical genius. The young Armstrong was caught shooting off a pistol as a child, illegally, to celebrate July 4th and sent to what was called the Colored Waifs Home. There he learned music and obviously had an aptitude for it, and in time became the genius that we all know. In terms of Jews, jazz, and joints, however, there's a side story. As a small child, Louis often lived with the Karnofskys, a Jewish family that is still present in New Orleans today. Among other pursuits, the Karnofskys sold coal to heat the houses in Storyville, and little Louis would sit atop the coal in the back of the truck and blast notes on his toy trumpet to announce their arrival. Feeling sorry for the near orphan, Mrs. Karnofsky would bring him home, tuck him in at night, and sing him lullabies in Russian and Yiddish. In appreciation for this nurturing, Louis became proficient in Yiddish and wore a Star of David around his neck for the rest of his life. And it was Morris Karnofsky who gave him money to buy his first cornet. Like many New Orleans musicians, with the closure of Storyville, Louis traveled to Chicago in search of jobs and other opportunities. There he met a most extraordinary man named Milton Mesrow, one of the most interesting people in the history of American culture and music. Mesrow, later known as Mezz, was born to a Jewish family in Chicago and was sent to reform school after being caught stealing a Studebaker. There is where he was first exposed to jazz and the blues. He became so intrigued and entranced by what he heard that he learned to play the clarinet and began to identify with Afro-American culture. He was determined, in his words, to, quote, become a voluntary Negro. When Mezz was imprisoned, he insisted on being housed in the African-American section. Fellow jazz musician Eddie Condon memorably remarked, quote, when Mezz fell through the Mason-Dixon line, he just kept going. Mezz formed many close relationships with some of the greatest musicians in Chicago, not just Louis Armstrong, but King Oliver, Sidney Bechet, the great New Orleans clarinetist, and the great New Orleans drummer Baby Dodds. Mesrow was not only a talented musician, but garnered greater fame as the supplier of the best marijuana. So ubiquitous was the marijuana that he sold that at some point the joints became known as Mezz's in his honor. Like Louis Armstrong, Mesrow played and flourished in the mob-owned speakeasies that sprang up in the south side of Capone, Chicago. As was the case in Storyville, these African-American musicians found some measure of fame and fortune and an element of racial equality in musical establishments nominally rejected by the white power elite. Mesrow spoke about the wave of creativity unleashed by cannabis. Quote, the first thing I noticed when I smoked marijuana was that I began to hear my saxophone as if it was inside my head. Then I began to feel the vibrations of the reed much more pronounced against my lip, and my head buzzed like a loudspeaker. I found I was slurring notes much better and put in just the right of feeling, and in my phrases I was really coming on. All the notes came easily out of my horn, like they'd already been made up, greased, and stuffed into the bell. So all I had to do was blow a little, send them on their way, one right after the other, never missing, never behind time, all without an ounce of effort. End of quote. By birth, Mesrow was white and Jewish. His wife was an African-American Baptist. When asked about this religious upbringing in 2015, Mezz's son, also a musician, responded, quote, my father put me in a synagogue and my mother's side tried to make me a Baptist. So today when I'm asked what my religion is, I just say jazz. Louis Armstrong had this to say, quote, we always looked at pot as a sort of medicine, an inexpensive high and with much better thoughts than one that's full of liquor. Armstrong kept getting busted for marijuana, but the judges and the police were usually big fans, so he was not subjected to the harsh and racist treatment that so many of his fellow musicians experienced. He told one great story about an evening gig in Chicago he played one night after being busted for smoking marijuana. Quote, I went to work that night. We all was just like nothing happened. What struck me as funny, though, I laughed real loud when several movie stars came up to the bandstand when we played a dance and told me they heard about me getting caught with marijuana, but they thought it was Marihuana, a white chick. Ooh boy, that really fractured me. The racism and the fear of change has always underscored the hysterical efforts of the last century to ban marijuana. Harry Anslinger, the odious head of the Federal Narcotics Bureau from 1930 to 1963, was forever trying to stamp out cannabis. Anslinger memorably said, quote, 50% of the violent crimes committed in districts occupied by Mexicans, Turks, Filipinos, Greeks, Spaniards, Latin Americans, and Negroes may be traced to the abuse of marijuana. Now, as I said in episode 1, the idea that smoking a joint makes you want to go out and do violence is a stupid idea only proposed by people who've never smoked marijuana. As we all know, the opposite is true. The freedom from conventional constraints and the importance of improvisation in jazz and marijuana was not lost on Richard Nixon, whose war on drugs was fortunately lost. Many years after Nixon left office, John Ehrlichman, one of his henchmen, said the laws were never about the drugs. They were about controlling and disenfranchising the anti-war activist nonconformists and the African Americans who used them. And then finally, to bring the story forward many decades. What was the impact of marijuana on rock music? In Rainy Day Woman No. 9, Bob Dylan sang, "Everybody must get stoned." Before Bob Dylan turned them on the pot, the Beatles were the Four Mop Tops, singing "She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah." After Dylan turned them on to marijuana, they morphed into Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and sang, "I Am the Walrus, Everybody Smokes Pot, Smokes Pot, Smokes Pot." I spoke in the earlier marijuana episodes of how a Harvard professor at the School of Medicine named Lester Grinspoon was well known and well regarded for getting students off, as well as other people, particularly young people, who've been busted for a single joint, when he would very effectively testify on their behalf. So effective was Grinspoon as an expert witness. And remember that Grinspoon started out thinking that marijuana was evil and addictive, then did intensive research and found out the opposite was the case. He ended up in 1972 appearing as an expert witness on John Lennon's behalf when the Attorney General was trying to get John and Yoko expelled from this country because they were seen as dangerous to the Nixon administration. Over dinner, Grinspoon recalled, quote, "I told John how much cannabis appeared to make it possible for me to hear his music for the first time, in much the same way that poet Allen Ginsberg had seen Cézanne for the first time when he purposely smoked marijuana before setting out for the Museum of Modern Art to determine if he could, with the help of marijuana, break through his incapacity to relate to the artist Cézanne. John Lennon was quick to reply that I'd experienced only one facet of what marijuana could do for music, and that he thought it did wonders for composing and making music, as well as listening to it." So said John Lennon, one of the most creative musical geniuses of the 20th century. Clearly, marijuana is a plant of the gods.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe and share. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity within the Amazon. Want to learn more about the plants of the gods? Follow Dr. Mark Plotkin on Instagram @DocMarkPlotkin to stay up to date on upcoming events.